Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. This is another lightly edited version of a live stream. This one we hosted back on December 13th with Steve Salaita. We'll include a link to that live stream for folks who want to watch the conversation, which is one of my favorites we've hosted since we launched our YouTube channel as a companion with this audio podcast a few months ago. Steven Salaita is an educator and the author or editor of 8 books. His written work includes Nationalism, Decolonizing Native America and Palestine, Uncivil Rites, Israel's Dead Soul, and Anti-Arab Racism in the USA, Where It Comes From and What It Means for Politics. His forthcoming book, An Honest Living, a Memoir of Peculiar Itineraries, will be released in March. In this episode, we discuss several of Salaita's recent interventions regarding the Palestinian resistance and Israel's genocidal retaliation. All of the articles we discuss can be found on his website, stevesalaita.com. Because it was a live stream, audience members were also able to ask questions, and Steve was gracious enough to answer several of those as well. A quick note, in order to catch up on some of the 15 audio podcasts we've recorded but haven't released yet, we will focus on editing and releasing those over the next couple of months. So if you haven't yet, make sure to go over to our YouTube channel and click the subscribe button and turn on notifications. A link to that is in the show notes. Over there are a number of conversations we haven't yet converted to audio, and we will continue to host more live streams there as well in the coming weeks. If you want one central place to stay abreast of all of our work, become a patron of the show for as little as $1 a month. You will get an email with every episode, new live stream, new study group, or new publication that Josh or I put out, and it is the best way to support our work and keep it coming. You can sign up for that at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism. I've really appreciated a lot of the interventions. I've been following the work that you've been putting out. I've followed your website for a long time, but just especially, in recent months now, since October 7th, you've put out a number of pieces, all of which I think are important in their own ways. So I think your most recent piece is this piece, Scrolling Through Genocide. And I think, it touches on what's been a really surreal experience for everyone. You talk about this theory that had kind of existed, where you say you no longer ascribe to it, but that if the whole world is watching, right, that a genocide cannot unfold, ethnic cleansing can't happen, in a digital age where we have so much access to events on the ground, images, depictions, things like that. And, you discuss this through your own engagement with settler colonial studies and indigenous studies, from the context of Turtle Island, which I know you have really worked at this intersection of, Palestine studies, Middle East studies, and then indigenous studies and Native American studies. So I realize, this question is just going to ask you kind of rehash some of what you laid out in that piece already, but say a little bit about that theory and why you think it has been proven incorrect in this case. And, I don't mean that in the sense of prove to us that it's incorrect, because I think we can all see that it's incorrect, but I'm interested in the sort of dynamics of, the U.S., Israel that, have caused it to be incorrect in this case.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try to force I started doing work in comparative, settler colonization. It's been over 25 years now. I really started in 1998, 1999 when I was a graduate student. And, there was in those days, a lot of comparison of, Palestinians and indigenous peoples in North and South America had been done, particularly in activist communities. But this was really kind of a new or newish thing in academia. And so there was some enthusiasm and excitement, among my advisors and peers at the time, but also some trepidation. And, one thing that people kept emphasizing to me was you have to highlight differences in addition to points of comparison. And I think that's a good practice anytime somebody's doing comparative analysis anyway. But kind of the going theory was that, well, look, natives are being displaced and dispossessed right now in the present. It's still ongoing, but really the bulk of it, or maybe what we would consider the worst part of it, happened off camera. It happened when there was no international law. It happened when, or when international law looked very different. It happened when it took news a significant amount of time to travel around the world and so forth. And so you have to compare that to, the current Zionist project of ethnic cleansing, where it's subject to media scrutiny, it's subject to various international governing bodies, so forth. And so we just don't think that it could quite happen in the same way. So I've been thinking a lot about that because I always kind of bought into the idea that it would be next to impossible, for reasons of international scrutiny for, the Zionist entity just to move 2 million people or 3 million people or 4 million people across the border into another country. And we learned in recent weeks that actually that's really not as strong a deterrent maybe as we had thought. The deterrent to forcibly transferring Gaza's population, there is something of an American diplomatic deterrence. There's an Egyptian deterrent, but I don't think anybody truly believes, listening to Israeli politicians and watching the news, that such a thing would be unfeasible. There's an idea that, yes, it absolutely could happen. We could imagine, as horrible as it is, based on how horrible everything has already been, that, the Israeli military is just going to start, slaughtering people wholesale or push them across the border if they refuse to go of their own accord. And so I started thinking about, well, what does this mean? It means, first of all, that the past is more connected to the present maybe than we might have thought, and maybe to some we're overestimating the power of mass media. We were probably also overestimating the power of public outrage and international law, although I think probably a lot of people on the left would have been skeptical of international law to begin with, its utility or at least its applicability. Well, whatever skepticism we had has been reinforced. And so what then does that tell us about our position as beings in this world, as social beings, as political beings, as consumers of politics and media? And it doesn't tell us anything good. It's demoralizing and disheartening because, as you say, it's been surreal watching this type of violence come through on our social media feeds, coming through in news reports, in photographs, and just as a type or a scale of human destruction that I don't think we've yet seen, at least in this century. It's something not unprecedented in human history, but it's unprecedented, I think, in the social media age. And it's been absolutely horrible to witness. And part of the reason that it's been horrible to witness is not because our fellow human beings are being slaughtered in full view of the world. It's the fact that it is happening in full view of the world, and we can't really do anything to stop it. We can talk about it, we can educate people, we can just sort of scream, at an audience in a hope of gaining understanding or empathy, but we don't have any specific material mechanisms to do. How are we going to pressure the U.S. government? Okay, we keep writing our Congress people. They're not going to listen. They don't listen. What the hell is Joe Biden going to do? We can camp out at the White House, and people have been protesting all over the place. And the political class just ignores the protests. Cumulatively, millions and millions and millions of people on the streets in capitals of the metropole. Public opinion polls, even in Western countries showing great levels of support for a ceasefire. And then the political class in various countries, just ignores it. And there's no consequence for ignoring it. It's forcing us to think about what our very notion of civic or political engagement can even be in this day and age. We're powerless to stop a genocide even while we are being made witness to a genocide with modes of information that are very recent, that previous generations didn't have access to. And so in a sense that it makes it easier to understand what's going on, but it makes it much more difficult to witness because we get to see precisely what it is that we're unable to stop.
Yeah. What do you think, in regard to that, though, I mean, so I agree, and I want to get into more of this discussion of civic engagement and electoralism too, because you've written about this as well. But I also think, like, the tactics that inspire me in some sense in these times is like, Yemen stopping ships, right? Or even in the U.S. context, even though these things have been less successful so far, attempts to stop things at the ports. In the UK and in the US, there's some efforts around, shutting down Elbit, these kinds of things. I mean, do you think, though, that like a practice that is more engaged with the material mechanisms of this slaughter as opposed to the kind of appeal to, the benevolence of authority is more where we should be focusing our efforts to whatever extent that we can?
I do. I can't, these days, in my middle age, I can't rightly call myself an activist. So I feel a little bit, in not much of a position to be lecturing anybody about tactics. But yes, direct action is the most viable form of engagement. What the folks, very courageous folks in Palestine Action in the UK are doing is tremendous. It comes at a tremendous cost. These disruptions spark the authoritarianism of the state, and so people are putting a lot on the line. The organized labor has played an important role, shutting down the ports. All of these things are important. And then I think for maybe people who are working in the arena of ideas or in cultural contexts, I think, yes, it's important to highlight these forms of engagement as a way, I think, to people, I guess, to direct their energy into something that they feel can make an actual difference. And no one action or event, of course, is going to change the course of U.S. policy, but cumulatively, they do make a difference and they do make an impact, but it requires a lot of human power. It requires a lot of bodies. It requires a lot of organization. In some cases, it requires a lot of funding. And so, I think from where I'm positioned as somebody really who spends all his time, like just reading and writing at this point, I do want to make a compelling rhetorical case, a persuasive rhetorical case for the importance of disrupting, the mechanisms of the political mechanisms by which or through which this kind of genocide is allowed to occur, and then defending them. A lot of people, like to scold about this tactic or that tactic. And I think people are putting their bodies on the line when they're putting their freedom on the line. It's important, for us in whatever intellectual arena that we're working in, cultural arena, to defend them and maybe to, save the impulse to finger wag for a different time or maybe for a private conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So let's continue on this discussion of kind of the civic arena and electoralism. You have this piece that you've written, I think it's Genocide, Joe, and the Electoralists. So, I wanted to delve into this a bit. It's been particularly egregious to watch all the, well, there's multiple levels of egregiousness, but like one of the levels of egregiousness is the kind of influencer crowd, right? So these blue check, TikTokers, Twitter users, IG people who, have their short, like 3-minute rant on, oh, what, Joe Biden's committing a little genocide. I mean, there's people who have parodied this that I think it actually is difficult to parody in some sense because they're just very much saying like, what do you want to bring back Trump? Is basically all that they sort of have in the toolkit, and they can't even really articulate what it is about Trump that they imagine to be more evil than what is actually unfolding in front of our eyes right now. And I don't say that out of any respect or belief or support in any way of Donald Trump. Fuck him. But just to say like that is the that's the only message that we have. And it's kind of wild to watch that playing out. Like, we're a full year still away from an election, and there's a genocide going on right now. And so rather than, these people putting some effort into trying to move the needle a little bit, it's just sort of like already this defensive posture that comes right up. And so one of the things that you lay out is that, you have this, it's an argument actually that, I have a comrade, Brooke Terpstra, out in Oakland, and, he will talk about how there's this emphasis always in, especially the nonprofit world and other political elements, around civic engagement as an arena of organizing and struggle, right? And his argument has always been that we need to actually increase the level of civic disengagement, that we need more people to sort of disengage from these arenas and, organize and work in other arenas and other ways. And I'm sure hopefully we can have him on at some point to lay out his argument a little bit, because I'm not doing it a good service right now. But it reminds me a little bit of that. So yeah, I guess just sort of talk about your own posture at this point. I mean, I think going back and reading through some of your work, it's not really a new posture for you in a lot of respects, I don't think, but maybe heightened by the contradictions of this moment. But yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. I mean, you do a fine job of really explaining the sentiment, or maybe even the sensibility. But I would love to hear from your comrade out in Oakland. We probably are on the same general wavelength. So I honestly, I don't want to say that the people that are trying to compel us to vote for Biden are just the worst kind of mealy-mouthed bootlickers. I have nothing but contempt for them. I think really that's the only response that they're worthy of, and it's difficult sometimes to look past that very visceral feeling of contempt and move the problem into an analytical space. But we have to get past the contempt and into the analytical space, and that's what I tried to do with that short piece. And what does it mean that amidst a genocide that we're being disciplined into voting for the genocidaire? Okay, that's not just a failure of the moral imagination. It's a profound failure, really, of the political imagination. And I would argue, I think most importantly, a profound failure of the historical imagination. These are people who have been conditioned to think of voting as, the pinnacle of civic life. And maybe in a sense, in the United States, they're right, because it's always been pitched to us as the pinnacle of civic life, like a noble form of democratic engagement. And so, yes, I would agree that some form of disengagement is important, if only to get us in a different headspace than electoralism. There's a genocide going on. Why the hell are you worried about a presidential election? This country has 330 million people in it that we know of, probably more human beings inside of it than citizens. And, you're worried about these two 80-year-old creeps. We get to choose between one of them. That's what the choice comes down to, in a country this size. And then it's not even about choice. How does it even happen? Well, it happens because there are thousands of mechanisms in place that make sure that this is the outcome. And so by the time we get to the point of voting, the issue has already been settled. There is no dissentient candidate. There is no real alternative on offer. And I think for me, you could think of disengagement, as a type of civil disobedience, but I like to think of it in terms of a term that I've been using for years, probably to the point of cliche now, but a recalcitrance. And I wanted to, before I forget, give a shout out to the good folks at the Good Shepherd Collective in Palestine. They've really been writing a lot of important stuff in recent years about sort of this NGO complex that you're talking about, and how they're funneling so much of the energy of the Palestine solidarity community into these democratic spaces, these spaces filled with astroturf, etc. But with recalcitrance, it's sort of a refusal, saying I'm not going to participate in this process because I think it's a sham. And the response normally is, the normative response is that, well, then fine, then you're ceding that territory to the evil forces altogether. And I don't see it that way. I see it as trying to exist in a different space, a space where community is actually possible, a more loving space, a more compassionate space, a more affirming space, a space where I feel like I can love and be loved by human beings who share the same broad vision for the future that I do. And if disengaging from these normative political spaces, which are avaricious and fundamentally transactional, into spaces where our humanity is being mutually affirmed and where we're able to, I guess, discuss actual possibilities for the future that go beyond the dull bromides of U.S. exceptionalism, then I think that's an important move for people, if only on a personal level. But if you can give me a second, there's always an example that I go to that's been relevant recently. I was thinking about it when you invited me to come on to the program, an invitation, by the way, for which I'm really honored and grateful. But once you get electoralism in your mind as a project that can be transformative or even revolutionary in the United States, and there are all kinds of pratfalls that you end up ignoring, and those pratfalls always come back to bite you. And I'm thinking, of course, of Bernie Sanders, who's become a full-throated supporter of the current Zionist genocide. I don't want to relitigate arguments of the past, but there's one thing I want to point to in a friendly way, or maybe a comradely way, that there were people in the Palestine solidarity community all the way back in 2015 who were pointing out that, look, the guy's a Zionist. I'm not telling you not to vote for him or not to support him. You do what you want, but it's important for us to talk about. We can't just brush this aside and keep deploying Palestine as, a mechanism to get this guy elected. Quit beautifying Sanders through the issue of Palestine. Accept him or reject him based on what he is. And then, of course, those appeals were in typical electoralist fashion, because you can't have really any real dissent to electoralism, otherwise it becomes something of a political monster. Those critiques got shouted down, or they got ignored. Well, fast forward 8 years later, right? I hope now people can see why it in fact did matter that he's a Zionist, right? You can't be positioned as a Zionist, right, and then not take Israel's side in its moment, or what he considers its moment of existential reckoning. He left himself no other choice, and he had made it clear from the outset that this was going to be his choice if it came down to this. And so now what? Everybody is furious with Sanders for a good reason, and I joined them in their fury, and I affirmed their fury and their rage and their anger. But we cannot do the same bullshit next time. When somebody announces themselves as a fundamental supporter of Israel or as a Zionist, you cannot just brush that aside and say we're going to educate him, or we're going to keep him in check, or we're going to hold him accountable. Accountability is the biggest load of horse shit in the entire U.S. political lexicon, right? It doesn't mean anything, A, and B, it's never ever happened. And so now what? What are we dealing with? We're dealing with a whole lot of wasted energy. We're dealing with a whole lot of disappointment. We're dealing with no viable mechanism to communicate with the U.S. government, with U.S. policymakers, because we don't have any allies in that entire institution. And so next time, you have to be more circumspect. I don't like to tell people, whether to vote or don't vote. Do whatever the fuck you want. I don't care. Support whoever you want. But you have to be serious about it. You can't brush aside people's stated ideological commitments and then expect them to act outside of the boundaries of their stated ideology when the time comes to act. And this is what electoralism does to people. It's a mechanism to which they constantly trick themselves, Charlie Brown style, into thinking that they have a sort of power through the representative that they don't actually possess. That the representative into whom they're sort of subsuming their power, right, is actually acting independently of their opinion. They're essentially meaningless. And we have to reckon with that. And there are different ways to reckon with it. But, as somebody who's been interested in Palestine my whole life, I've seen it over and over and over again. I would love to find the U.S. politician that doesn't at some point throw Palestine under the bus. Until I see it, then I'm forced to continue believing that, we do need to disengage from this fantasy that using the parliamentary system of an imperial state is somehow going to produce an outcome that makes a meaningful difference in the lives of Palestinians.
Yeah.
Sorry for the rant.
No, I love the rant. Appreciate it. I mean, it was funny because in some respect, I had been playing for a while of whether we should invite Cornel West on and this sort of thing. And, and then right after October 7th, he comes out with this really both sidesy kind of statement. We have to condemn this violence and that violence and this and that. And, it was just I was yeah, and I'm not somebody, you probably know this having listened to Josh and I over the years, we're not people who are believers in U.S. electoral politics. But even it feels, even the idea of a protest vote, it's well, what are we protesting? Supporting somebody who's still very wishy-washy on, this issue. And ultimately, when it came down to it, right, they're not willing to disavow Zionism and, the settler colonial project. And I think this, this connects to your other work because, right, the settler colonial project of Israel and the settler colonial project of the United States, they are so historically, currently interconnected. Obviously we see, on full display the contradictions right now of the U.S. having a blank check for weapons, but then also we'll just ship you weapons without reporting it, or we'll just here's some white phosphorus for you to use. All of these things are just sort of coming out and being exposed right now. And, to a degree where you actually have, many institutions and governments basically just saying look, Israel's the 51st state. That's kind of the way that it feels in a certain respect right now. That's a rant of my own. I don't know if you want to say anything in response to that, but yeah, that's kind of the way I feel about that situation right now.
I'm with you. We're on the same wavelength. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to talk about your piece, Hamas as a figment of your imagination. I really enjoyed, as much as we can enjoy anything in these times, this is a great read. And, you write in it, quote, Hamas is one of the most complex formations of the past few decades. We know it exists by the rockets streaking through the nighttime sky, the soldiers adorned with green headbands, the theatrical destruction of Merkava tanks. It has a leadership, a command structure, a stash of weapons, a rank and file. It offers policy proposals and position papers. It negotiates with various state actors. Yet popular understanding of Hamas largely derives from its apocryphal position in the colonial imagination. The settler has transformed Hamas into a manifestation of his own paranoia and violence. You go on to write, Zionists are terrified of both Hamas and the idea of Hamas. In turn, they transfer responsibility for their barbarism onto the victim, end quote. And so that's just a specific passage. This piece really kind of lays out the many ways in which, we look at the way that Hamas is being, used in this current moment as a kind of rhetorical device. As you say, it plays on this imagination, and, there's interesting things because I think even within the left, even within, the various groups and formations that comprise the Western left, you do see a number of pieces that have come out that also, even in expressing some form of, I won't call it solidarity, right, but some form of sympathy, I guess you could say, right, with Palestinians. And there's a desire to either, work within some politics of condemnation of Hamas or suggest that we have to we need to wait or we need to support some alternative to Hamas, which is not like a real political force that, it's again pushing it off to some sort of future rather than dealing with the current moment. And so, this demand, of course, that Palestinians condemn Hamas has this much longer history now. It's been going on for a long time, that this is sort of precondition to Palestinians for being able to actually even talk about, what's going on, and, analysts and whatnot. And so what are the functions that you think this all serves? What maybe say through a little bit of what you're talking through in this essay?
Yeah, it's a complicated topic, and I don't trust myself not to ramble into a half dozen different directions without any coherent outcome. But I'm gonna try.
Rambling is welcome, so feel free to ramble.
That's good to know. First of all, we have to think about the different ways that Hamas is positioned in the political discourse, let's say in both the Arab world and the West, but let's stick with the West. And on the one hand, it gets discussed as a political formation, but more often it's something of a rhetorical tool that supporters of Israel use to mystify any type of Israeli violence. And so it maybe ties back into the point of mass media and everything existing on camera now, or everything being reported in real time. So Israel cannot plausibly deny, for example, that it just bombed a school, or that it stormed a hospital and rounded up all of its medical staff, or did some other horrible thing, because it's on camera. We have the testimony of the doctors. We have videos of the bodies of the children. I mean, this is where a rhetorical formation such as Hamas comes into play. Well, yes, we did that to this hospital or to this school, but that's because there's a Hamas bunker, or it's a Hamas command center. And so in that sense, Hamas becomes something unreal, right? And something as a projection of the Israeli psyche, and transposing onto Hamas the kind of barbarity in which they are engaged. So it plays that role. They think that, rightly, that it plays well to a Western audience. That's why they keep trying to conflate Hamas with ISIS, for example. And our friend Louis Alde wrote a good piece a few weeks ago, last month, talking about why the Hamas-ISIS connection is just cynical and terrible and just stupid. But anyhow, it's on Electronic Intifada, which everybody should visit and read anyway. So there's that. But there's also a fundamental misunderstanding. Let's move to what we would call the Western left, broadly defined. I think a fundamental misunderstanding or misapprehension of Palestinian society and the means of resistance that are available to Palestinians writ large, but let's say particularly Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, which is a unique situation. The West Bank is suffering terribly as well, and the West Bank has its forms of resistance, and some of them look very much like the type of resistance we see from the Gaza Strip, but some of the resistance from the Gaza Strip is specific to the Gaza Strip, specific to its geography, specific to its economic position, specific to its location, etc. And Hamas is a capable fighting force. And I'm going to leave aside any conversation about the ethics of its tactics or whatever. The fact of the matter is, along with the PFLP and Islamic Jihad, who work together on resistance, along with smaller groups, those are the three major groups in the Gaza Strip, they are a capable fighting force. And when a lot of Western leftists talk about, well, okay, Judith Butler did this in her essay, right? We need to envision a future for Palestine in which Hamas ceases to exist. This is not going to land right on the ears of Palestinians. All right. Palestinians have a variety of ideological commitments. All right. People who in their own space, in their own time, or maybe not supporters of Hamas, or who maybe are supporters of Hamas, but what a Palestinian who's familiar with Palestinian society, right, and the available options to Palestinians for resistance is going to hear is that we want to declaw Palestinian resistance altogether. We want to get rid of it. We want to wipe it out. And maybe that's the point in some cases. I don't know, but I don't always get the sense that that's the point. I get the sense that people are sometimes working in a utopian vision of Palestine where, it ends up looking like what they think Berkeley is. I don't know, but it's a way, it's very often sounds to us of not taking seriously the deterrence capabilities of Palestinian resistance, which is much needed when a population of over 2 million people are encaged and under siege and basically sitting ducks for Israeli aggression, for corporations to test weapons, for the state to test surveillance technology. There needs to be some sort of deterrence capability, and Hamas and other resistance groups with whom they work provide that. And I think to overlook that is a political mistake, and sometimes unwittingly, sometimes not. I think a form of political insensitivity. Another thing we have going on, if you'll humor me for another second, I
absolutely,
I deeply appreciate your patience. But a future without Hamas is also going to sound to a lot of Palestinians as a future that we don't get to decide. Again, this is among people who might support the party or not support the party, but it sounds to us, at least implicitly, like a lot of lecturing from the Western world about what type of governing mechanism needs to be put in place, what type of political parties ought to exist, what type of social policy ought to be enacted, et cetera, et cetera. And those things are in great debate and in great contest, in most cases, among Palestinians themselves, living in Palestine or those in diaspora with a close connection to Palestine. Those are issues that Palestinian society will have to work out when the time comes for them to be worked out. But now, when Hamas is functioning as the only capable deterrent force in the Gaza Strip, is not the time to have that, to work out those issues. And all Palestinians are aware that we're going to have to work out these issues. And maybe the process of working out those issues is going to be ugly and create some conflict and create some really deep disagreement. But right now, we're not having that conversation. We're trying to survive. We're trying to live. We're trying to get to the point where we can physically see an independent state, which may or may not have Hamas in the first place. And ain't nobody invited you into this conversation. It's not a conversation for you to have. It's none of your fucking business. Mr. PhD, Mrs. PhD from, fancy American university, to be telling Palestinians what type of political party they should have now or upon liberation. They make those choices, all right? Optimally. They'll make the choice themselves and it won't be imposed on them in a neo-colonial situation, as what happened in South Africa and Algeria and other places, right? Optimally, they'll get to make the choice and make their own mistakes or have their own successes, but it's not going to be mediated through Western academia. Western academia has fuck all to contribute to a post-liberation Palestinian political project. They need to get that through their heads already. So right now, you're going to be lecturing them as they're being bombed, white phosphorus raining on them. All this horrible shit is happening. They're being genocided. Step aside. They're worried about these things too. I promise you they're worried about these things as the people who are actually going to live with the outcome of their liberation or of their ultimate displacement. They are concerned about these things. They care about these things. And they know that there's going to be a time to have those conversations. And then finally about the condemning Hamas. I mean, I got a lot to say about this, but you know what it reminds me of? And I think that this will resonate with you, knowing where a lot of your political sensibilities, Jared, are located in, Black resistance, Black uprising, Black liberation, et cetera. And I know you all have on this pod done some really tremendous work around that issue. It reminds me to some degree, discursively anyway, of the appeal to Black writers and thinkers and activists to condemn Farrakhan as a means to getting access into civic life, right? That, you need to condemn Black anti-Semitism. You need to condemn this Black public figure, that Black public figure, et cetera, et cetera. And I know a lot of people are hesitant to do it, right? A lot of Palestinians, right, even those who aren't ideologically inclined to Hamas, don't want to do it. And maybe part of it is for the reason that I just said. But part of it is a matter of simple principle. You are in no moral position, white liberal, to ask a Black person about structural violence, right? To be assuaged by the subjects of your racism. And for Palestinians, it's a similar thing. You Zionists are in no position to ask me to condemn any form of violence. So will I condemn Hamas just to satisfy your predilections? No, I won't. Why won't I? Because fuck you. That's why. I'm not tap dancing to your ideological preferences on principle. Whether I like Hamas or don't like Hamas, A, is none of your business, and B, it's not your position. It's not your place to ask me to disavow an important segment of Palestinian society while everybody in that society is currently suffering a genocide. What you need to do first and foremost is condemn your own government, the one that you're supporting, and you're pretending that you're not, but you are. Even asking me to condemn Hamas, I already know that I got a liberal Zionist on my hand, no matter how they self-identify. It's a dead giveaway every single time, right? So why don't you condemn Zionism? I want to hear you condemn Zionism, disavow Zionism, before you ever fix your mouth to ask me to condemn any aspect of Palestinian society. I need that. It's the same thing with the anti-Semitism debate. It's like, no. I need you to disavow yourself of anti-Arab racism before we even begin to have this conversation. Don't be asking me to distance myself from racism, or racism which I've never expressed, by the way, when you yourself have built your entire political ideology, right, around a form of structural racism that's having these terrible consequences that we're witnessing in real time. So you start with the condemnation, right, of your own political positionality, right, and then we'll take it from there.
I think that's exactly right. You're getting a lot of shout outs in the chat for that, everything you just laid out. I want to uplift this too, because this is something I've thought about a lot amid all of this, too, is like, look, I think that the actual history, right, of socialist states supporting self-determination is a little bit checkered. There's, some good examples of it, some parts where maybe we go back and critique and say, well, that wasn't really a very good defense of self-determination there, so on. But the principle of it, I think, is very important for us to go back to, because Lenin was quite clear himself that, a nation has the right to determine what type of politics that it has. And even we had this conversation recently, be coming out in a little bit with Eugene Puryear on the Black Belt thesis. But even in the sort of U.S. context, right, the Black Belt thesis was also contingent upon an understanding that if Black people chose not to have a socialist state, that was okay. It wasn't the thing that the communists were going to advocate for, right? But they weren't going to place a contingency upon their advocacy of self-determination on the outcome being exactly what they wanted. And I think that that's similar in terms of, I know we're in different contexts. I know we don't have an international communist body that is supporting this principle or something like that. But I think as people on the left, that principle of self-determination is very important. The idea that, we can't wait for this idealized version. We can't say, oh, we're only going to support Palestinians if we think that the Palestinian state is going to be socialist, or we think that, the PFLP or whatever people's preferred Palestinian political orientation might be. That's, like you said, it's not up for us to decide. And I mean, I agree, talk to yourself, but talk to any range of Palestinians. A lot of people in Palestine are critical of a range of the political parties and perspectives. And, that doesn't mean that, and I think we can listen to those, we can learn from them, we can understand more about kind of the internal politics in Palestine. I think that's important too. But to think that we can impose, it can't be that, people can't be allowed to choose that, they can't be allowed to be represented by that, or to, it's quite absurd. It's hard to think of. I think it's really kind of a long retreat of a politics of self-determination that have produced a kind of politics where we think, no, actually, you don't have self-determination. I want your freedom on my idealistic terms.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah.
And then they want, I think part of it stems from this desire for the perfect victim, an innocent victim, in a sense, a victim without agency, or a victim who's amenable to the patronage of, an outside, more enlightened benefactor.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Anyway, we've made the point, I think. So one more of your piece, and this was one of the pieces that you wrote. It was the first piece that you wrote post October 7th. So it was about 12 days after that you published this. So it was a practical appraisal of Palestinian violence. It's a beautiful essay in many ways. And it came at a time when there were so many of these kind of bankrupt reflections from Western intellectuals. You started by talking about your time many years ago at a refugee camp in Lebanon. I'm just going to quote a brief section here. You talk about witnessing the kind of jubilation of the people in the refugee camp as they responded to martyrdom operations. In time, you say you came to understand that the jubilation was largely an expression of hope, and a simple hope at that. The deeply human desire to return home. Every operation against the colonizer represented a possibility of return. The Palestinians weren't looking at the situation through an abstract or idealistic lens. They were consummately practical. Nobody wanted to live in a refugee camp anymore. And, I haven't had these experiences like you had, or spent time there, but I've always been, in some ways, in awe of kind of how clearly Palestinians understand their struggle. I think this is because in the West, we tend to have a lot of ideological confusion, confusion about, what exactly it is, I think, that we're fighting for. And there's a lot of different visions of this. And that's not to say, I know that there are different visions within the Palestinian context. And there's many, we just talked about kind of disagreements, factions, parties, points of view, of course. But there is a kind of unified understanding around a larger sort of goal or purpose, which, as you say, is relatively simple, And, I think you're laying some of that out in the piece. And, we're watching, obviously, as we've talked about, this widespread, this genocide that's going on. It's widespread ethnic cleansing, which Israel is seeking to kind of complete, it seems like, especially with regard to Gaza. I don't know, there's many people in the West Bank who are also very worried about the events that are unfolding there. And, we've seen over 1 million people that have been displaced from their homes, and this is a displacement of people who are already displaced, and despite all of that, it doesn't destroy the resolve, of course, of Palestinians to return, to reclaim what is rightfully theirs. And there's this very difficult, I think, emotional or psychological balancing act we've talked about a little bit on this podcast, just in terms of kind of, that there's optimism that is produced by the resistance and the capacity of the resistance in this time. But then there's also this despair at just sort of how depraved and genocidal Israel's response is. And so, I'm just interested in kind of where you're at in making sense of this, kind of 2 months in. And yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you. You frame it really well. It's sometimes volatile mixture of optimism and despair. And we obviously so many of us are taking our cue from, the folks who are suffering these horrors. But it's always been in a way, for colonized people or for oppressed people, the greatest form of resistance is to not lose their vision for freedom, because that's what the oppressor, what the colonizer always tries to take away first. And I've thought a lot about it in the context of my meager life. And, we all want to leave something meaningful behind, or contribute something meaningful to the world. And I think very often people are contributing wonderfully meaningful things to the world, very often without knowing it. And I wish they did know it. But in my writing, my political work, to the degree that I ever get an opportunity to organize with actual human beings anymore, if it's critical to keep alive the idea of freedom. And we might not see a completely free Palestine in my lifetime. It partly depends on how much my dietary habits catch up to me, or when they catch up to me, I should say. But if I quit smoking, maybe it'll increase the chances by a few years. But anyway, at least I want to keep the idea alive on our own terms, not mediated through the eyes of the oppressor or through the common sense, the practical wisdom of the oppressor. Because, Gramsci taught us a lot about the problems of dominant notions of common sense, that they inherently work in the favor of power. And so what understood to be commonsensical is actually the needs of the ruling class being presented to us as practical. So I'm talking about our own ideas of freedom, the ones we fought for and worked for and died for, keeping it alive. And by keeping it alive, you also are keeping alive the material possibility of freedom. And that's really the sensibility that I discern so often from Palestine, that amid all of this horror and suffering is, an idea of steadfastness, of resistance, of defiance, of humanity, that we're not going to become the monsters that they say we are, that we're not going to leave the land or just die, to make colonization easier for them, that we're going to maintain our humanity and we're going to keep the idea alive, so that if I get killed tonight, the idea is going to survive me, and then the idea becomes the inheritance of my children and my grandchildren and my descendants, however many generations that it takes. As long as we keep the idea alive, that becomes the inheritance of the next generation. And that really is the central message of the now very famous poem of the martyr Rifat al-Adir, that if I die, keep the fight alive. If I must die, let the words outlive me, let the idea outlive me. And I really think that poem really kind of perfectly captures or encapsulates what it is that you're saying, that we might not survive this ordeal physically. We might not even survive this ordeal emotionally, right? But we will survive the ordeal spiritually. And those who come after us will have a mantle to take up, a cause to take up, and they will have something to build, something that we've left them. And I think that's one of the most important things that a person can do, whether they're an important intellectual or activist or whether there's somebody that who nobody knows about, who just likes reading in the corner of their room in the evening. Keep the idea of freedom alive, and don't let it be mediated through the pragmatism or the common sense of the oppressor. And in that way, we will one day survive the oppression.
Well, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you lifting up Rifat as well, very much. Yeah. So I have a couple other follow-ups. There's a couple of things I've starred in the chat. So folks, if you have other questions in the chat, go ahead and drop them in and we'll try to get to a couple things. So one of the things I did want to bring up is that, many years ago now, it's funny, in prepping for this interview, I knew more of your recent work, but didn't quite realize how much you had written in like the first decade of the 2000s and in the early 2010s. And so you had a book that was about anti-Arab racism in the U.S. in the years after 9/11. And in that, you made connections to the settler colonial past. And so, I realize I'm going to ask you to sort of summarize what was a book in a question here. But I'm interested in, because part of the reason I bring this up is that we're absolutely seeing this again. We're absolutely seeing a return domestically to the sorts of responses that we saw to Arab Americans, to Muslim people in the United States after 9/11. It's interesting in some respects. Maybe there's some differences. I mean, it feels like a lot of it is playing out on college campuses in this time, which might have been a little bit different than post 9/11. I don't know. But, I'm interested in kind of how you're thinking about that in this frame, and anything from that body of research that really stood out to you that you wanted to kind of share.
Yeah, I would love to. The book you're talking about was published in 2006 or 2007. I mean, I was a pup back then, fresh out of grad school and brimming with life. But I'm gratified that somebody still read it. Although I'd probably be scared to read it now. So much has changed in my own mentality and in the world that I wonder if it even has any relevance. But and also, like after the Illinois fiasco, one thing that kind of sucked, among many, was that, I wasn't the guy who, had written about X, Y, and Z. I was just like the dude who got fired. And that, do you know what I mean? And it's like, no, I mean, like, okay, but I've done some stuff too, other than getting shit canned. But anyway, what strikes me as, I think, the major difference, first of all, one of my theses in that book, it is the first book that I ever wrote, is that Zionism is an important driving force of anti-Arab racism in the United States. So, okay, that hasn't changed. And that it's really through the issue of Palestine that a lot of anti-Arab racism gets articulated tacitly without appearing on the surface to be racist. And of course, I'm learning new ways each day how, anti-Black racism functions in the same way, and anti-Indigenous racism functions in the same way. So probably even more insidiously in those other cases. But so where you can say something like, I believe in the right of Jews to have a Jewish majority state. Well, okay, that seems like just a regular political proposition. Well, there's all kinds of anti-Arab racism, sort of appended to that sentiment that doesn't come to the surface. We have to extract it, and we have to dig for it. And I think that's the case. That's one way that anti-Arab racism functions, through pro-Israel sentiment or through a anti-Palestinian sentiment. But now I would say that, Islamophobia remains a strong motivation. That is, I think people who, for whatever reason, would be considered identifiably Muslim, right? Whether it's because they're wearing a headscarf, a woman, or a guy is presented in such a way as fulfills some sort of stereotype of the Muslim, they're more likely than, just, some rando who happens to be Muslim, right? to encounter some sort of violence. But now really it's the Palestinian symbols, right? So it's not just, sort of anti-Palestinianism as the tacit vehicle for anti-Arab racism, but now it's become the explicit vehicle for anti-Arab racism. And obviously, the most dire example is of the 3 young men who were shot. Was it in Maine or Massachusetts? Somewhere in the Northeast.
I think it was New Hampshire, but somewhere.
New Hampshire. Okay, my apologies. Yeah. Who were shot for wearing their kuffiyas. And then I just saw a video on Twitter a few hours ago of somebody just identified as a Muslim woman who was harassed by the spouse of a Harvard faculty member for displaying the kufiyya. And then, in the days following October 7th, we saw the woman in the video in New York City put her hands on a child at a Palestine demonstration. And so I guess what I'm trying, it's a long-winded way of saying that now it's the objects that are specifically identified with Palestine that seem to be evoking the worst kind of ire, the type of ire that people are physically acting on. And so if I were to update that book, which I'm sure needs a ton of updating, I would point to October the 7th as an important moment in a shifting of how this racism is expressed. And it's moving from a very broadly defined Islamophobic sensibility into something that's specifically focused on symbols of Palestine national culture, real or imagined. It's in the United States, and in other places too, I suppose. It's a literal physical hazard, to wear a keffiyeh or to display a Palestine flag, and media and pundits like to frame it as crazy people acting on some illiberal impulses, but no, it comes out of racism. It comes out of the statements that Joe Biden makes, presenting Palestinians all as rapists and murderers. It comes out of this particular condition of genocide, and I would argue that it's an extension of the genocide. And again, the young men, God bless them, they made that connection explicit in all of their comments after the shooting, that this is an extension of the same genocide. This is part and parcel of the same process. So this is one way in which a genocide in Palestine is having very real and devastating effects on the U.S. social order.
Yeah, it was actually Vermont. Thank you to the chat for correcting us on that. And I mean, it's interesting. There was a video yesterday, I think, that I saw that went viral that I believe was in Montreal. And it was of an unhoused person who was wearing a scarf. And this is the other thing, too, is it's like there's so much kind of weird paranoia about it that state forces are harassing people because they think it's a keffiyeh, right? And so this is actually, and we saw some version of this on social media where I think it was some ADL like goon or whatever was like, they're imagining keffiyehs where they're not actually, where it's just a scarf, it has a little pattern to it or whatever. And so, yeah, I mean, it's kind of thinking about that level of paranoia. And the other thing I would just uplift is that, I've talked to some students since October 7th, and the other thing that they've said is that they definitely do feel that students who present as Muslim because they wear some version of traditional Muslim dress are facing heightened harassment and surveillance and so on in these times as well. So, all right. Questions from the chat. So I'm going to pull up a couple things. So there's a couple questions. These are kind of connected, so I'll link them together. So one was, in your view as a longtime educator, should pro-Palestine undergrad students in the West organize on campus or focus more efforts outside the university? There's a similar question of what role do faculty play and how do or should people most effectively intervene in the various universities supporting role in the Zionist project? I think this is a very interesting, both of these are important questions. I think I'm thinking about them in particular in that the state has, through the lobbying of Zionist organizations, they have basically successfully now conflated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism through U.S. Department of Education policy, which also means that these universities have some sort of, responsibility, quote unquote, to investigate anti-Zionism essentially on their campuses and to try to stop it, essentially. And so obviously there's a lot going on college campuses, but navigating this is very, people are walking on shaky ground right now, as they always have been. I mean, obviously you yourself are an example of this, but I think that the example of your firing and the kind of things that you've been through, I think, is a broad project right now,
Well, I thank you, Walter and Lou, for the questions. I'll try my best to provide a satisfactory or meaningful response. The fight on campus strikes me as deeply important and meaningful, not simply for the people that are invested in any particular campus community, students and faculty and otherwise, but just in the culture writ large. I would say that the university is an important site of contestation that goes beyond its own boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
They're extremely hostile places, as Jared points out, for students and faculty and workers and otherwise to organize. I mean, no, really, not just around the issue of Palestine. That's the most obvious one, but labor rights, all kinds of things. They're really becoming, at the administrative level, deeply reactionary places, and the donors are getting more and more involved, which is never a good thing for functional human beings with souls. But
Right.
no, you cannot cede the space of campus to the Zionists and to the reactionaries. There's too much at stake. If they get their way without any resistance, then there's never ever going to be the possibility of a functional campus or a functional academic freedom or a functional curriculum or just a functional anything on campus. Any aspect of the education that we hold dear, that we hold as important, will cease to exist, more or less. Okay, and some of you all might say, good, let the whole university collapse. Okay, then if you want the university to collapse, right? I mean, look, I'm not going to knock you. Right? That's cool, but this would be one way to do it, is ceding it to the Zionists and all of their reactionary sponsors and colleagues. As to the faculty, I got a lot to say about this, but here I don't want to move into my own version of finger wagging, but I would say primarily, among other things, it is the role of faculty to defend your students. Defend your fucking students. Don't leave them at the mercy of outside pressure groups, of donors, of administrators, none of whom have their best interests in mind. You have to have their best interests in mind. That is your job. That's your obligation. That's your responsibility. So if they are being, so what do you even care about Palestine or not, right? They're your students. They're on the campus. You need to defend them on principle from from sites of power that are greater than them and that can cause them real harm. Not every goes beyond the old-fashioned harm of like getting expelled or whatever. Now they can be arrested, they can be prosecuted, they can be turned over to the state, they can be deported. And so faculty need to first and foremost defend their students. Second of all, and I guess it's just as important, speak against their own colleagues, their own reactionary colleagues who are making the campus a living hell for everybody else. You don't have to raise your voice publicly. You don't have to get in the middle of campus with a soapbox and a microphone. But in the spaces in which you work and in which you have influence, you need to maintain some semblance of sanity in your little corner of the campus and make sure that people aren't promoting or enacting policies that are causing harm to your colleagues, that are causing harm to students, that are causing harm to the community. You can speak against them. Yes, it's okay to be scared. It's normal to be scared. It's wise to be scared. But at the same time, in a time like this, in a moment like this is not a moment for bashfulness or to punt on it. You need to draw a line and you need to hold firmly to that line, because real harm is being done, in some cases irreversible harm, right, to your students, to your colleagues, to your workers, to your community members. And they need anybody with any modicum of institutional power, right, to stand against this. And even if you end up being ignored, even if administration runs roughshod over you, it's very possible that they will. Even if you get ignored completely, I think it's important at least to try and have your objection registered on the record. You have to say something.
I appreciate that. And I also, I've been thinking about this a lot because there's also these dynamics, as you well know, within the academy of there's tenured faculty, right, who maybe have a little bit more leeway in terms of what they can say publicly. And then there's people who are on, who are on tenure track or like, contingent sort of faculty, whether this is like lecturers or adjuncts or whatever, who very likely will not work again if they say certain things publicly. But yet there is, I think, a decent amount that those folks can do. And I think sometimes, we get very obsessed with the kind of politics of making a statement and saying something publicly, when in fact, there's a lot to be done on the ground. That does not necessarily mean that you're sticking your neck out and going way out on a limb in quite the same ways as making certain statements would be publicly. I don't know how you feel about those dynamics.
I feel as you do. And yes, thank you so much for making that distinction. I guess I had in mind erroneously, I was thinking about faculty with some sort of institutional power, i.e. tenured faculty. But no, that faculty includes all types, all the way from graduate students to senior scholars. But I would really put a lot of contingent faculty and precarious faculty, and then, non-tenured track faculty among the classes of those who need to some level of protection among their institutional peers. But yes, sometimes, again, just to reiterate, you don't need the soapbox and the microphone. Sometimes it's important, sometimes it's necessary, but that doesn't need to be everybody's mode of being a good, colleague or a good teacher. I've never liked it when people accuse one another publicly, especially people who don't know each other. Well, what have you done for the movement? Or what have you done for this? Or what have you done for that? It's like, well, you don't know what the fuck they've done or haven't done. You don't know how to measure their effect. Maybe every single day they're making people's lives better among those they come into contact with. Their students, their peers and colleagues in ways that you don't see, in ways that aren't recorded for the internet, in ways that aren't posted on Instagram, right? And so I think that, yes, precisely what you're saying, that being a good teacher, a supportive teacher, being a good colleague, a supportive colleague, creating an atmosphere where it at least makes it slightly easier for people to survive these terrible times on campus is a deeply important thing to do.
Appreciate that. There's people are putting great stuff just in the chat in terms of questions. This question in particular, I wanted to bring up to you because it's something that your work, I think, addresses directly. So this question was, what do you think about Zionists questioning SJP organizations about their positionality as participants of native land dispossession because their school campus is on native land or is on stolen land, to invalidate calls to shut down a broad campus in Israel? And this is something that, for folks who haven't read it, you go into in Inter/Nationalism in these, dynamics of the fact that in the US, in Canada, in Australia, we are also in contexts of settler colonialism. And so this gets used as a gotcha a lot by people saying like, oh, you're against settler colonialism, but you're on stolen land right now in this university. And this is something that you have actually spent some time thinking about. So yeah, please.
Thanks, Joel. If I pronounced your name correctly. What do I think about Zionists bringing that up? I think that the Zionists who bring it up, as Zionists tend to be, are full of shit. I don't think that any SJP needs to listen to them. If there are any SJP members or activists out here listening, my advice is you don't have to listen to them. They have nothing but the worst intentions for you in mind. They don't give a shit about Indigenous people or Native Americans. They're using them as a rhetorical cudgel to facilitate support for their own genocide. So you don't worry about it. You do what you need to do. Listen to the people who you need to listen to and keep moving forward. But having said that, yeah, it's of course important, for us as Palestinians, as people really of any, nationality or cultural or ethnic background. in the so-called United States who's not native or indigenous. This is always important for us to think about our positionality, right, vis-a-vis the politics and the history of the land that we're on. And from what I see from SJPs and from young Palestinian students or young pro-Palestinian students is that, most of them spend a great deal of time thinking about it seriously and taking it seriously and making efforts to be in some kind of contact or conversation with their indigenous brethren. And so I don't think that, practically speaking, philosophically and morally speaking, Zion has got no leg to stand on. But I think even practically speaking, I don't think the Zionists who are raising that critique have a leg to stand on because, we can all do better, all of us, certainly myself, but SJPs, I think, are doing a very good job of, reaching out to people in the Black struggle, in the indigenous struggle, in various, forms of labor struggle. And if they're not doing that, then they should, right? They should. It's important for them to do. And so the answer for SJPs to that question is ignore them and just keep doing what you're doing, right? They're not serious about Palestine. They're not serious about Native Americans. But you can be serious about Palestine and about Native America and think about your relationship to this land on which you're studying and the way that it might inform your understanding of Palestine, but also more important, inform your understanding of the types of things that you can do as an activist, as somebody who wants to make the world better on the very land on which you stand. What forms of contestation still exists there? What forms of indigenous sovereignty or self-determination are still under threat or still in contest in some way? And you can find ways to lend your support to the indigenous peoples, either the students on your campus, the faculty on your campus, or people in the surrounding community. It's always important to think about where our struggle for Palestinian liberation intersects with, or at least has something to contribute for struggles for liberation on whatever ground we happen to be standing on in the particular moment, whether it's Native American or any other one. So I think the way to undercut that particular critique is by saying, yes, the United States and Canada are colonial powers as well, just like Israel. And yes, I support Native liberation on their ancestral homelands, just like I do for Palestinians. Next question. I don't want to talk about it. And then, do you think it's an accident? Do you think it's a coincidence that the nation state, the settler colony, now, committing a massive genocide in front of the eyes of the entire world, has as its main sponsor other genocidal settler colonies in the United States and Canada or other colonial powers like the UK? It's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. So we can make those connections, but you don't have to listen to the critiques of bad faith actors. I would suggest instead listening to what Native peoples themselves have to say to you and then starting the conversation from that point.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There was actually another question that was asked that's kind of a quick related follow-up to what you had just said, which is, what advice do you give students who have some space to organize on campus, but you see them getting very bogged down by impotent little provocations by Zionists on campus, where, yes, what are maybe better ways for them to direct their energy, or how do you think about that? I mean, obviously it's important, as you said, not to cede all of these spaces of contestation, but there is also this very disruptive character that can come about from the way that Zionists can relate to pro-Palestinian organizing on campus.
Don't let their desires be the point of your strategy. In other words, if you all want to do something, if the CP wants to put an event or an action together, and it runs into some kind of provocation, Zionist provocation, or it gets shut down or whatever, then pivot to a new one. Just pivot, just keep on going. All right, they can't control or occupy all the space. Think of it metaphorically, as in Palestine itself. They can keep building that wall. They can keep stationing people in the watchtowers. They can build that, but they cannot control all the space. And there's always a way to get your ideas through the frontier that they're trying to control. So just be resilient, keep doing it, but don't let fear of their response determine at the outset what it is that you choose to do or not to do, based on your own needs, based on the need of the Palestinian students and the other students in campus, the anti-Zionist Jewish students, etc., based on their needs. You come up with your plan, and if they throw a roadblock in there, okay, they're going to do that. Protect yourselves. Don't sacrifice anybody. Don't get yourselves kicked out of school. All right? You're smart. Sit down together, find a way around the roadblock. They put another roadblock up, you find a way around that one. But there's always a way around. And so you don't in the end ever have to be stopped, because being on the side of the oppressed means inherently that you're going to have to be more creative and imaginative than the oppressor. And I'm confident that you're up to that task.
Right on. This is kind of, it's a little bit of a different question. It's kind of a geopolitical, question. But do you have any thoughts on the nuclear threat that Israel presents in the region? Obviously, I think that there is a lot of, this is one of the, it's discussed in certain spaces, but there's not necessarily a lot of discussion all the time of the potential that this has to break out into a much larger war, considering kind of the belligerence of the state of Israel, of the Zionist entity.
Yeah. Thank you, Jay. I really don't have any wise words to say about it. It does frighten me. I'll confess. I think it's in the backs of a lot of people's heads that there is this nuclear capability, and what that means for the ability of any sort of resistance to be successful. And going all the way back to the Fateful Triangle, which I think Chomsky published in I want to say 83, 84. It's an old book. Even back then, he was talking about the idea that Israel will deploy or potentially or threaten to deploy the nuclear option rather than concede any significant territory. And so I think about it in that way. How is liberation even possible without a kind of mutually assured destruction? I just don't know. It's very difficult to disarm a nuclear state, and I really don't have any useful. I don't know what that means geostrategically or geopolitically. If anything, I think it raises the importance of our ability to curtail Israel's power in this world. Because when we think of all of the possible outcomes that can come of, Israel, acting on its, its own impulses, all of them are very ugly, and we want to avoid that ugliness to whatever degree that we can.
Yeah, appreciated. I mean, I think, I have another question. I'll save it for later, though, because there's a couple of others I want to get to. So, question posed about tactics and strategy. There's a lot of different types of things going on, especially, I'm sure that's true everywhere. But in the U.S., there's, marches. There was a proposed kind of general strike on this past Monday. There's obviously folks who have been doing the work to try to blockade shipments at ports and things like that. But I think what Ivana is posing here is, something of a useful question for us to think with, which is that the existence of a variety of tactics does not necessarily mean that there's a strategic orientation to all of this. And, I think that's a tricky thing. I'm not saying it necessarily as a critique, because there's a number of different organizations that are involved, and a number of them may have their own strategy in mind. But, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ivana, for tuning in and for the question. I hesitate to make myself any kind of arbiter about tactics, because the people doing the actual organizing know a lot better than I do. And I really don't want to be, proffering any sort of unsolicited advice. I don't think that that's my place, but a general observation is that it really depends on really the location of the group will determine a lot about what kind of tactics that it can use or what kind of tactics are viable for it, what type of local government exists there. How do the police generally behave? Where are the politicians at? What has happened to people who have tried certain tactics before you? Did they get thrown in jail? Did they lose their jobs? And so all of this you have to take into account based on the local tactics. So I also think that the timing is important. So there's a general process of just thinking through what seems like the most optimally effective tactic given the context of any particular situation. So you have to make collective decisions about the context of any particular situation. So I'm not huge, for example, on just as a general proposition on, disrupting talks. That can be good theater, and generally I don't oppose it, but, I would think that disrupting a weapon shipment at a port sounds to me more important. But, I mean, if you don't live next to a port, then, if you're in the middle of Indiana or whatever, right, then, that option's not available to you. And so maybe you'll get the chance to disrupt the talk. But here's what I mean about timing and context. So when, that hideous genocidaire, Barry Weiss, sicked her mob on our beloved martyr, Rifat, she really it's just a horrible thing. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, she targeted him for recrimination while he was still alive for a joke that he had made. And of course, thousands and thousands and thousands of trolls and bad faith actors ended up piling on this man who was living in the middle of a genocide. Right? Just unconscionable levels of horridness. But the day after Rafat was martyred, maybe 2 days after, shortly after, Barry Weiss is giving a talk at the University of Texas. And, because it's Barry Weiss and because she's exactly the kind of reactionary that state legislatures and university administrators love. Like the president of the University of Texas was there, the brass was there basically, and a whole bunch of people disrupted it. They disrupted it. They yelled Rifat's name. They walked out. And that struck me as, in that moment, in that context, as deeply important. Right. So that not only to honor the memory of our friend, but to sort of send a message that you're not going to do this to one of us. You're not going to do this to one of our martyrs. And, then peacefully go around the country peddling your bullshit to anybody who will listen. That there's going to be a consequence. It's a peaceful consequence, but this is going to be the consequence. You're never going to go out in public again without hearing Rifat's name. He is going to haunt you forever. So in that sense, right, I see disruption as an important tactic. I mean, will that tactic liberate Palestine? No, but that tactic is going to give us energy and a sense of purpose, and maybe even a smile from the above. But again, so I'm just yammering now. It really depends on what's available to you based on circumstance, based on location, and based on history. What worked for the people in your community, before now? What didn't work for people in your community? How did the local elite respond to action X versus action Y and these sorts of things? But I would say that anything is on the table, and what you pull off of that table should be based on what you all think would collectively, as a group, will think has the best chance of being effective based on the outcome that you desire. And I always advise, this always helped me back when I was younger, that I would start with the outcome. Okay, what's the optimal outcome that I want? And then sort of work backwards from there. What action is most likely to get me to this outcome?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I want to lift up a couple other things, just folks, just shouting out Rifat, and people very appreciative of your commentary out here. Yeah, Rifat wishing he were a freedom fighter so he could die fighting back. I mean, I remember that also on that Electronic Intifada, one of his earliest discussions at the beginning, and him talking about, all I have is this expo marker, but if they come into my house, I'm going to fight them with that, and I think it's amazing, the ways that he's continued. That's been something beautiful that's come obviously from his martyrdom, is the way that people have lifted up his words and his work, and I think that's one of the things it's interesting, is that I think a lot of us who work within that, I feel this way working in spaces like this. I'm sure you will feel this way sometimes working in academia and, cultural workers and stuff like that. Sometimes we can feel like our work, is not that important. And I mean, in some sense, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it does come down to, as we can see, it comes down to weapons and military capabilities and all of these things. But there is an importance to cultural and intellectual work. It has a connection, I think, to this struggle. We can see it, I think, quite specifically, but also to all of our struggles, how we narrate them, how we think about them, the art that people create to lift them up. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to share on that.
And nothing more lovely than what you just said, that, yeah, that stuff's always going to be important to me, important to us. Again, when it comes to the physical liberation of, a colony or an oppressed community, we don't always have the tools at our disposal to create that outcome, but we have tools. We have tools to make life a little bit better, and life a little bit happier, and life a little bit more meaningful. And we should use those tools. It's a beautiful thing to use those tools, and then to be in community with one another around them. And I really, it's just, I keep thinking, Jared, I was like scrolling Twitter earlier today, and you know how, I don't know, maybe I'm the only one who does this, but when somebody, like a famous liberal Zionist makes a tweet and then everybody responds, I read the responses because they cheer me up, because often they're so clever, or at least they're affirming. And I keep seeing Rifat's like responses. You know what I mean? Like, all of a sudden be scrolling, and then, oh, there's Rifat with the 3 poop emojis, and
Right.
I can't, can't wrap my head around that. He's not physically here with us, but it's little stuff like that. He's here with us in spirit, but when he was here with us physically, we were able to, I hope, provide some measure of relief for him in those very dark moments when he was living through the genocide, and he was able to provide us a ton, in a tremendous act of generosity through his writing, through his lectures, through his poop emojis on Twitter. Right? Even those remain meaningful because they're making a statement. And so, yeah, I can't liberate Palestine, sitting here in my living room, but it really does. I've never put any of my writing behind a paywall. I just don't want to. I understand why people do. There's no condemnation or judgment for anybody. You all do what you need to do. The reason that I don't is because I'm able to go without one, but it gives me such tremendous joy when somebody finds some sort of meaning in something I wrote. It makes me feel deeply connected to that person. It makes me feel intimate with that person, and it makes me feel like I've done at least something, however tiny, useful with my day, maybe even useful with my life. And so those forms of connection are really meaningful, and they're made to outlast us. However long it is that we're here, they're made to outlast us, and I think that's what's so intimate and beautiful about them.
Yeah, you said something that I do want to. I'm trying to remember now where I remember you talking about this, and actually maybe it was related to Muhammad al-Kurd. And I think you've written about the importance of kind of playful defiance, or sort of mocking, some of the ridiculousness that you do encounter. And I mean, Rafat obviously makes me think of that, both in terms of the joke that Barry Weiss was attacking him over, but also just the poop emojis, right? And so, I feel like that's an important thing as well for us to keep in this, because it can be quite dark, and yet I think about that sense of humor that Palestinians are able to also practice in relation to that. It is an act of defiance, of samud, of steadfastness, as well. Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts that you want to share on that.
Oh, again, nothing as well as you put it. But I agree. The humor is not just a defense mechanism, but it's a source of resistance, and yes, it's a source of joy. Even in this terrible suffering, we want to smile. We need to smile, and it's nice to be able to make other people smile with a well-timed joke. And if it's a well-timed joke that also happens to really expose the idiocy of some Zionist formation, that's all the better. I mean, Muhammad Kurd is he's really good at it. He's really good at it. I really like Ali Abunim's humor. He has a kind of dry, withering humor, but it can be really, really sharp sometimes. And yeah, so these are the and Rafat he was excellent at it. So, but I think in general, it's something Palestinians are good at, and it's more than just making lemonade out of lemons. It's a way of surviving. It's a way of defying. It's a way really of just exposing the absolute inanity and just surrealness of the situation that they're made to exist in.
Right on. This question I hesitate to ask because I think it's kind of an impossible question, but I'm going to share it anyways. We'll do it as your kind of final, and then if you have any other closing thoughts that you want to add. But I do think that obviously it is important to, as we've talked to throughout, to remember that there is a genocide going on, that there is this, ongoing act of ethnic cleansing. And we have that, and we have the ultimate liberation of Palestine that we also hold as, a goal, as an aspiration. And so what are your thoughts on this, on, kind of the question is, what do you think is practically and strategically necessary and effective for both an immediate end to the genocidal escalation and for the ultimate liberation in Palestine? Again, I acknowledge this is an impossible question to answer.
Yeah, it is. Thanks, Stevie. I mean, it's a good question. It's just a difficult question, and I reckon that the fact of its difficulty is what makes it good. And I know it's on a lot of people's minds. I'm not good in this area. I'm not. I know my strengths and my limitations, and one of my limitations is that I'm not a good theoretical big picture thinker. I'm much more comfortable in the world of rhetoric and discourse. But we'll say that again, it depends on where you're at, what you have access to. Obviously, for somebody who's living in Palestine, it's going to look a lot different than somebody living in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. But as a general rule, steadfastness, a refusal to concede a solitary inch, philosophically, morally, or politically, to the oppressor, that's critical wherever you're at. Once you cede that inch, once you cede that millimeter, they're going to keep going, and they ain't going to be satisfied until you are fully submitted to their authority. Find any groups that are doing work that you think is important or meaningful and join up with them. There's not an individual answer to this kind of question. It's always a group answer, a collective answer. I would also suggest, if you're talking about the end of the genocide and the liberation of Palestine, then we all around the world need to think seriously about the question of resistance and on-the-ground resistance, and what type of it we're willing to support, and more important, what type of it that we're willing to defend. That's where the lines get blurry for people, for all kinds of reasons. Even people who might advocate for a certain form of resistance will be too scared to say it out loud. Again, no judgment. I understand why that is and why that has to be, but at some point we have to force into the discourse a serious reckoning with and a serious conversation about Palestinian resistance that goes beyond the silly Orientalist tropes that we've heard a million times, or about flattened, ridiculous condemnations of Hamas. That, that these conversations need to be taken seriously, that they need to happen. And so, yeah, resistance and liberation, they go along multiple tracks, but two of the tracks are how they exist in the discourse and how they exist militarily on the ground. Figure out which one you can help and, sort of take it from there. And I'm sorry that I can't give a better answer, but really that's the best answer that I can give.
I appreciate that answer. And I know we're going to be in dialogue, and maybe we could have a longer conversation more on that topic at another time. I would love to talk about that more with you and with other folks, because I think that, it is such a critical thing. We try to do it in ways that we can here, because it is very much that I think we do need to engage in this politics of trying to push forward a ceasefire, trying to do what we can especially in the United States and, folks in the West and in UK and, so on and I mean, everywhere, right? That, is funneling things to the Zionist entity at this time. But it is also important to not just, excise out the actual resistance, which is ongoing from that conversation. And a lot of folks do that, even if it's just, in certain cases, it's because people have an issue with it, which is kind of what we talked about earlier, in terms of like the need to condemn Hamas or to say Hamas can't be a part of the picture or whatever. But I think for other folks, it's maybe that's in the back of their mind, but they actually, at least in theory, do support the ability of Palestinians to resist, but are still afraid to have those conversations for a variety of reasons that, we do understand, but we have to have them nonetheless. They're important to have. Appreciate everybody for your comments and engagement in the chat. Folks, everything that we talked about in terms of Steve's work is can be found on his website, stevesalaita.com. It's been a real honor and a pleasure to have you on here, and I do look forward to having more conversations with you, hopefully soon.
I hope so too. Thank you, Jared, and thank you, everybody.